Hello again, folks, and welcome back to Total War Warhammer 2. In preparation for the Vampire Coast to come out, which, by the way, looks fantastic. If you watched the Ever-Chosen tournament stream, oh, I had so much fun watching that. The Vampire Coast looks amazing. But in preparation for them to come out, I've been playing more Total War Warhammer 2, and I've been starting to kind of try to spread myself out a little bit, because I really do have a few factions that I like and I'm pretty good at, and then there's a ton of factions that I haven't really done a whole lot with. So obviously, I like the Greenskins, my first love in Warhammer. I like the Skaven, and I would say I'm pretty good at Skaven. Not top tier by any means, but pretty solid with the Skaven. And I really like the Tomb Kings, or more specifically, the followers of Nagash, because they have a little bit more flexibility, and Ark in the Black is just fantastic. I like the Tomb Kings in general, but I think the followers of Nagash are a little bit better, because basically they have everything the Tomb Kings have, plus they have access to bats and direwolves, which fill some holes in the roster, and they have access to crypt ghouls, which are a very, very handy kind of mid-tier infantry, sort of comparable to the Nehekar warriors, but in my opinion a little, well, they're different. In any case, so there are a few factions that I like and am pretty good at, and then there are a number of other factions that I just don't play much, if at all. And I want to kind of rectify that gap before I get into the Vampire Coast, which I intend to play a lot. They look very cool. So today, I'm starting something a little bit new. I'm going to be dipping, at least a little, kind of shallowly probably, into a bunch of different factions, looking at them and playing some battles with them. I'm not going to do a full faction week like I did with the Skaven and the Lizardmen and the High Elves back when, and the Dark Elves and all that, but I am going to kind of skim through at least a lot of them. And I started out today with Norsca. Norsca is a faction that I don't think I've ever played. I don't remember ever playing them. I may have played them once or twice back in Total War Warhammer 1 when they first came out, but never really deeply, and of course they've changed quite a bit since then. I've never really played much with the Regiments of Renown. I just haven't done a whole lot with them. So I thought, hey, let's jump into Norsca, because Norsca has some similarities to some of the factions that I do play. Like the Skaven, they don't have a whole lot of cavalry. They have a little bit of cavalry. They have a little bit of skirmish cavalry. But they don't really have a whole lot of cavalry. They mainly focus on having a really hardcore infantry line and monster backup. So that's kind of their big thing. They're a very melee-centric army. They don't have a whole lot of ranged support. They have some, but it's short-ranged. And it's just monsters and magic and very, very hardcore infantry for Norsca. So let's go through them really quick, and then I'll show you my first little battle with Norsca. Analyzing Norsca, as I said, very, very melee-centric, and very, in my opinion, very singular-aimed. The goal of Norsca is to smash enemy units one after another. You kill something, you kill something, you kill something, you moved on down the line, and ideally, if you've done it right, you roll up the enemy by isolating and destroying their valuable units, and then just kind of grinding through the valuable targets. You don't necessarily need to win every fight, and you don't need to fight everything at once. Norsca has, unlike, for example, Skaven. Skaven want to engage pretty much everything at once, lock the whole field down, use their artillery and their rat ogres and stuff to snipe out vulnerable enemies, use assassins and magic and to win the frontline engagement even when you really shouldn't be able to, because your units are garbage. But with the Skaven can bring a lot of support over a large area and kind of blanket the whole map in screaming rats and warp fire and lightning and all that kind of stuff. They can kind of lock the area down. Norsca doesn't do that so much. Norsca rushes in and crushes something and then moves on to crush the next thing in sequence. So you've got the Marauder Chieftain, which is your basic lord, and looking at him, he's really nothing special. He's got the basic lord abilities. He's got Fight or Die, which is a melee attack buff, which can be pretty nice in a big scrum. For mounts, you've got the Norscan Warhorse, the Marauder Chariot, and the War Mammoth. The War Mammoth is the only special one for Norsca, and right now mammoths are kind of sad. They're not super, super useful. They give you a ton of HP, but they also make you a huge target. And unfortunately, due to some kind of animation glitch right now, they're not actually very effective at doing what they want to do, which is stomping out infantry. Now, that appears to be fixed in the patch, the II patch coming with the Vampire Coast. Also, eye patch. Ha! Good one, CA. In any case, They do appear to be fixed in that they can drag through infantry like chariots, which makes them terrifying against infantry. But they remain very large targets with mediocre armor, and generally not terribly impressive stats. They do a ton of damage, at least. Certainly the Lord-ridden ones do. But they're also quite expensive, of course. The Mammoth is 1,200 points over the cost of the Lord himself. I wouldn't normally use a Marauder champion, the Marauder chieftain, sorry. I just don't think he's, for the cost, I don't think he brings much. Wulfric the Wanderer and Throg are the two that are actually useful, the two legendary lords, and since the Norscan lord roster is so skinny, those are the two important ones. The valuable thing about Wulfric is that he can ride a horse or a chariot. The Mammoth, once again, I wouldn't really put him on a Mammoth. It makes him quite vulnerable to being sniped. But he can ride a horse or a chariot. And he has the Hunter of Champions, which is a debuff you can drop on an enemy lord or hero, and it makes them suck. It makes them awful for 24 seconds. It cuts their speed in half, drops their armor, and then turns their melee defense basically down to 0. Most units will go to 0 melee defense with the Hunter of Champions on them, and that means that Wulfric can then get on them with his melee attack, which is nothing terribly special, to be honest. Well, on a horse or foot, it's pretty special. On a chariot, it's not. On a horse, where I would usually take him. He's got high weapon strength, not a lot of AP, but high strength, and a high melee attack. You drop the Hunter of Champions on somebody, and now they are slower than Wulfric, and they have melee defense nearly 0, which means he can catch up and just beat the shit out of them. No trouble. You can also take the Sword of Torgald, which gives you plus 75% weapon damage. Now note that does not increase his armor piercing at all, but it increases his weapon damage by about 240, pushing him up into the 600s. Actually, I'm sorry, pushing him up into the 700s total. Mostly mitigated by armor, but it makes him an excellent sniper of mages and support heroes and support lords. If you have a lord who is not a heavily armored melee fighter, Wulfric will crush them instantly. If you have a lord who is a heavily armored melee fighter, Wulfric can still probably beat them if he pops the Sword of Torgald and Hunter of Champions simultaneously. So Wulfric is good at that. His other ability is the Sea Fang, which lets him do damage to lines of infantry. Since people tend to stretch out in spaghetti lines, all you have to do is engage with one of your cheap infantry units, drop the Sea Fang, and you'll do a ton of damage to a valuable infantry unit. It's very, very potent. It really is. And it goes a long way, so you can easily hit 2 or 3 units with it if your enemy obligingly lines up. It's a great wind ability. The other option is Throg. Throg is actually in some ways better at beating the shit out of lords, because he has a bonus versus large, and every valuable lord in the game has a mount at this point. And he has a bonus versus large. And he has mainly armor-piercing damage, is what I meant to say. Plus Frostbite, so he passively lowers the speed of people that he's in combat with just by hitting them. So his attack versus monsters is actually 88, and his damage is over 500, and he is just incredibly powerful. The Wintertooth Crown, expensive, wouldn't really bother with it, but Copious Vomit also allows him to blast armored infantry or possibly cavalry, which can be useful if you can get them locked down. So Throg is actually a better anti-monster fighter than Wulfric is, but he's not as fast, he's larger, and he has less armor. He does regenerate, that's nice, but if your enemy brings especially armor-piercing archers or artillery or something, Throg will be shot off the ground pretty quickly. In terms of heroes, you have Shaman Sorcerers, you have Werekin, and you have Fimir Balefiends. Balefiends and Shaman Sorcerers, it just kind of comes down to what lore you want. I would always take the Balefiends if you want fire or shadows. They are much, much tougher than the Shaman Sorcerers. Tougher, faster, bigger, they have missile resist, and they're much more effective in melee. It doesn't look like it because their melee attack isn't as high, but they sunder armor and their attack is magic, plus they do AP damage, which the Shaman Sorcerers do not. The only reason to really take a Shaman Sorcerer of Fire over a Fimir Balefiend of Fire is if you want to put him on a chariot to ride down infantry. On a chariot, he can ride down infantry very effectively, so that's nice. But, of course, that makes him just as expensive. So, once again, it's kind of a trade-off. You can either have the chariot dude trolling around crushing infantry, or you can have the Balefiend, who is still a little bit more durable, and at this point also a smaller target, plus more damage. In general, so spellcasters, it kind of depends on what schools you want. They all have good things going for them. Metal, of course, has the Transmutation of Lead and the Final Transmutation, both of which are great spells. Final Transmutation is a very powerful damage spell at this point, and a few other utility spells. Fire has... Fire is still not fantastic for damage. The Burning Head can be pretty good, and of course Flaming Sword of Rune is a fantastic buff, as well as Cascading Fire Cloak. Cascading Fire Cloak is pretty good as well. My favorite is the Femur Balefiend of Shadows, because he has Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, which is a great little debuff. It just slows people down. It does a little bit of damage, but more importantly, it slows them down and lets you catch them. And then you've got the Enfeebling Foe, which is an excellent debuff. The Penumbral Pendulum, which once again wipes out lines. These spells that wipe out lines, I love them. And these other spells, they're useful. Pit of Shades can be good against hordes, but generally wouldn't really bother with them. The Skinwolf Werekin, on the other hand, is an anti-large hunter with large, a large bonus versus large, lots of damage. You can give him a Potion of Speed if you want, but generally, I would just keep him like this, and you use him to hunt down cavalry and mounted lords. And he's big, he has a lot of HP, he regenerates, he has Frenzy, he has anti-large, he has okay armor, not great. And so if you can get him onto Luin Luinkur or something, you know, some big monstrous lord that's causing you trouble, he'll do a lot of damage to them, because he has very high weapon strength, and of course that big bonus versus large that kicks his melee attack up to 81 against large units. In terms of infantry, Norsca's got it all. Norsca has every level of infantry for every specialty. They've got Shielded Cheap Chaff, they've got Spears, they've got Great Weapon Chaff, they've got a couple RORs, they've got the Marauder Berserkers, who are the most efficient two-handed, dual-wielding Berserker-type infantry in the game. They kick the crap out of Plague Monks, they kick the crap out of every other unit of this type that's about this cost. They beat War Dancers, they beat everything at their level, because they have this special ability where, if they're in combat for longer, they get better and better and better as they go along. So if they start off getting physical resist, which stacks with their armor, of course, then they get extra melee attack, and then, well, then they go crazy, which is okay. It doesn't matter at that point. If they've been in combat with a single unit for 90 seconds, they've killed it. Unless they lost. Unless it's heavily armored and they're losing. But their weapon strength is incredible. They have a small bonus versus infantry, high melee attack for the cost, pretty high HP. They have over 100 HP per model, which is a little bit nuts for a human model. And then you have the Marauder Champions, who are your elite, heavily armored infantry. Funnily enough, Marauder Champions are not particularly better than Storm Vermin, the shielded version, but once again they have this Rage ability, where they get extra leadership, then physical resist, and then melee attack the longer they're in combat. So these guys can grind it out really, really well because of that Rage. And the Marauder Champions with great weapons, generally a better unit. They don't take a melee attack penalty, which normally great weapons do, and they actually do more damage and have a higher charge bonus, so they're just really, really good. Norscan Infantry, definitely a highlight of the faction, very solid. Marauder Berserkers are excellent, the Brutes of the Hound, the ROR Berserkers are excellent, and Marauder Champions with great weapons are excellent. In terms of missiles, you've got anti-large missiles and you've got armor-piercing missiles, both short range. You have chariots. Ice Wolf chariots have frostbite to slow people down. That's basically the only big difference between them, except for general stats. Missile cavalry, javelin cavalry, armor-piercing throwing axe cavalry, and higher quality javelin cavalry. Generally better in every way than Marauder Horsemen, but I'm not sure if it's 200 better. The main thing they've got is more range, more damage, and more ammo. The melee stuff, I can kind of take it or leave it. In terms of monsters, you can ignore most of this, to be honest. There's two things in this category. Well, there's three things in this category that you want. Ice Wolves, which have frostbite that slow people down, and their ROR, the Beasts of Tash-Nar, which also have anti-large, can be very useful, and Frenzy. Armored Skin Wolves, who are incredibly powerful anti-large specialists, a 30 bonus versus large, so they can tear up cavalry real quick. And Femir Warriors with great weapons, who are outright overpowered, I would say. Very high weapon strength, high bonus versus large, high melee defense and armor, which makes them very tough to deal with, and they are armor sundering with magical attacks. So they are brutal. I'm not sure if there's a cavalry unit in the game that can win a fight with these guys, including more expensive anti-large cavalry. I mean, I think Demigryph Knights will beat them one-on-one just barely, but they are rough. They are rough to deal with. They frankly overpower skin wolves. Skin wolves are faster by a good margin, and they regenerate, but that's about it. Those are the only benefits. So I would usually use female warriors, great weapons. In terms of the rare monsters and beasts, pretty mediocre. Giants are bad. Mammoths at the moment are bad. War mammoths do have, they kind of have low leadership. Lots and lots of HP, which is nice, but I wouldn't really bring them until the patch drops. And frostworms. Frostworms are just dragons. They're big old dragons. If you want a dragon, you can kind of do an off-meta kind of thing by bringing an air force, which Norsca normally doesn't. But to be honest, you can contest the air well enough with javelins, since your Marauder Hunters have this pretty big bonus versus large. 15. They do 50 damage versus large per javelin, which is fairly crazy. So you can zone out large air units pretty effectively just with a couple Marauder Hunters and a couple of Fimir. I wouldn't necessarily feel the need to contest the air exactly. So what do we have overall? Norsca's a very melee-centric, very rush-heavy faction. They've got magic support that lends itself well to breaking infantry lines and slowing down enemies. They've got lord hunting abilities, and lord hunting lords, basically. And they've got monsters, which are excellent at supporting the line by stopping cavalry and other monsters from getting to your infantry while your infantry breaks the enemy infantry. You also have anti-large missiles and armor-piercing missiles for that same reason. Everything is built around singling out important enemy targets and crushing them, while your infantry line kind of does the work of grinding out the slugging match. So with all that in mind, I went into my first Norscan battle against Bretonnia. And let's look at what we took. So, my list. I didn't, of course, know what the enemy's list was going to be. My list, I thought Bretonnia. Bretonnia has cavalry. They tend to bring lots of cavalry. So I brought 3 Marauder Spearmen with their bonus versus large. I have a female Balefiend of Shadows. I have Wolfric the Wanderer to hunt out the enemy lord. I wanted somebody who could potentially contest Leon Kur or could hunt down the Fey Enchantress. I have 1 Marauder Berserker in case of need to clean up some peasants. 2 Marauder Champions with great weapons. In hindsight, I probably should have brought the shielded versions since normally Bretonnian infantry isn't very well armored. 2 Marauder Hunters with javelins for, of course, shooting down cavalry. And 2 Female Warriors with great weapons for the same reason, to club down heavy cavalry, which is what I anticipated. I also brought 2 Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes for the armor-piercing value against questing knights, grail knights, all that kind of stuff. These guys will definitely pay their dues. Now, the enemy brought a very, very wide peasant build, only a couple of cavalry units. He's got mounted yeoman archers, 3 of them. Good choice because I can't really deal with them super effectively. I can slow them down, but my anti-large units are not fast. So speed 92, can't really catch. My Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes don't have the range to stop them, and so they can kind of pick away and hopefully get a little bit of value that way. He's got questing knights, armor-piercing, charging anti-infantry shot cavalry. Questing knights and questing knights, 3 of those. He is led by the Fey Enchantress, and then he has a big old pile of infantry. Men-at-arms up front, 4 of them. Foot squires in the second line, 3 of them for the anti-infantry armor-piercing value. Peasant bowmen with fire arrows and pox arrows, so poison and fire damage. Fire damage for against regenerators, like skin wolves. If I brought any skin wolves, these guys would have been very dangerous. And then 2 men-at-arms with polearms in the back, in case I had brought female warriors or skin wolves. These guys could do pretty well with their high armor-piercing and bonus versus large. The Fey Enchantress, let's see what she had brought exactly. She had, of course, the Chalice of Potions, Favor of the Fey, Arcane Conduit, Regrowth, and Earthblood, so healing spells, plus the Mist of the Lady, and that's it. So she'd stripped off all except the healing spells. I took Wolfric with most things. I gave him the sword, and of course I kept all his cool abilities. I did put him on a horse, so he has the Sword of Torgald. And my Female Balefiend of Shadows has the Arcane Conduit, Penumbral Pendulum for damage, Enfeebling Foe, Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, and this From the Mist ability, which gives him missile resistance as long as his leadership stays up. So, as soon as the battle starts, I start rushing forward. I can already see what I'm going to be running into. I'm just going, okay, that's fine. It's just a whole bunch of infantry. We're going to crush them. Meanwhile, my Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes were pushing up. I was hoping to try and push these guys back and get in to throw a couple volleys onto the questing knights. I was totally willing to sacrifice both of these guys in order to kill one questing knight, but I saw all the yeoman archers coming in and I thought, well, no, I better pull back. I take a lot of damage from arrows. Shifting over my Fimir in order to kind of zone these guys out, and I'm also trying to bring up one of my hunters with javelins in order to hit that yeoman archer. Going to try to get a miasma on them to slow them down, maybe let them have a volley, but the miasma does a little bit of damage, which is nice. At this point, I just go, alright, what the crap, I'm just going to push out my horsemen aggressively. They're clearly on skirmish mode, so we do get a couple of shots as we come in, but it doesn't really do much damage. The important thing is just that it's zoning them out. I'm taking the damage on these guys while my Fimir push through this way to try and get after the cavalry. In the front line, he dropped an Earthblood on his mounted yeoman archers, which I think is kind of a weird choice. But now the infantry lines are coming forward to engage. My Marauder Berserkers, right in the center, will collapse any Bretonnian infantry they catch, but they're likely to be destroyed by archer fire. The Marauder Champions have 80 armor but no shield, so they will also take damage from archer fire, and this was when I was thinking, wow, I really should have brought the shielded versions, because I don't need armor piercing here. The highest armor I have to deal with is 70. And Marauder Spearmen on the flanks, hopefully trying to deal with cav. Now, these questing knights are swooping in, and I was kind of paying attention over here, so I didn't quite see them. I'm pushing these guys in to try and get after those questing knights, like I was saying, and the Fimir are hanging back a little bit. My javelins have paused at the back to reassess and gain a target. Here come the questing knights on a charge into the champions. Pretty good charge, do a lot of damage. I have my spears chasing them as they try to withdraw, and my Fimir Balefiend is swinging up this way to try and get in range to hurt them a little bit. Meanwhile, over here, I've caught these questing knights with my Fimir, and I'm crushing them. They are getting thwomped so badly. That was perfect. That was exactly what I wanted to see. My Marauder Berserkers are in melee, but are getting shot to hell. I got a miasma off on those guys, and a Sea Fang off on these men-at-arms, which then unfortunately plowed into my own Berserkers a little bit. Over on this side, the questing knights are about half dead, and I'm actually pulling off in order to chase these guys away, hopefully go after that unit of questing knights. Marauder horsemen, meanwhile, are driving off the skirmishers in that direction. Over here, we've collapsed some of the men-at-arms, and Wulfric has charged in after the Fey Enchantress. We've got Hunter of Champions on her. Wulfric has popped the Sword of Torgald, and he is beating the crap out of the Fey Enchantress. Exactly what I want to see. She's down almost dead, but she barely manages to get away from this fight with the help of the questing knights, the other cavalry, and then the men-at-arms with polearms. Her leadership tanks as she takes damage. I do actually break her here. But in the back, my Marauder Hunters with javelins have been throwing into infantry and pushed forward this unit. This unit is firing at those questing knights and driving them off, but the Fey Enchantress does manage to get away as Wulfric gets tangled up with the foot squires and the men-at-arms with polearms. Over on this side, the female warriors have crushed that questing knight unit. They've engaged these questing knights and done a lot of damage and are starting to bring back in as they come to clean up some infantry. My infantry has taken a lot of damage from the archers. The archers are doing quite a bit of work supporting the Bretonnian infantry. Nice chalice of potions, but very much misaimed. Wulfric is not a great target for that. Should have waited for the Marauder Champions to be up here. My hunters with javelins are coming up to start throwing into the polearms, and at this point I'm just pushing infantry forward to try and disrupt the archer formations. Some of my units are starting to come back in the rear, and now my Fimir are into the archers. The enemy cavalry are charging in the questing knights, but they do have these Marauder Hunters with javelins right here, throwing their javelins directly in and also engaging in melee, which isn't great for them, but they can still throw when they're on guard mode, and so they do pretty significant damage to those questing knights. I get another little bit of a Sea Fang through the edge of these units, does some damage. Wulfric is kind of standing there, looking for a target. He's looking for the Fey Enchantress, but he gets sucked back into combat. Over on this side, we do have my Marauder Champions pushing the infantry back, engaged by the Fey Enchantress and some rallied cavalry here, and the Fey Enchantress is healing up. My Fimir, meanwhile, are trying to pull out of these men-at-arms with polearms, not having much luck. They got stuck. These Fimir, however, are having a field day just beating the crap out of all this infantry. These Fimir are really trying to pull into those peasant bowmen, but they're consistently getting sucked back in by the models that are stuck fighting the polearms. Really don't want to see that, especially not with their melee attack buffed like this. So these Fimir warriors probably going away. Meanwhile, my skirmish cavalry over here have totally massacred an enemy unit of cavalry. We've got some mounted yeoman archers sitting around. Infantry are starting to rally on this side, which could be a problem, but once again, the Fey Enchantress is isolated. Wulfric has finished off his opponents, my javelins are finishing off these questing knights, and my Femir are pushing forward in order to take out the Fey Enchantress. Once she's surrounded by these guys, she can't get out because she doesn't have much mass on the horse. She sees that coming, runs away behind her archers, but the Femir can tank archer fire. With 110 armor and regeneration, archers are not something they fear. Wulfric has circled back around to try and ward off these infantry and is now pushing forward to attack the Fey Enchantress again. She's got a regrowth going, but she really doesn't want to be anywhere near this fight. These Femir warriors are absolutely going to give it to her. My infantry, meanwhile, is pushing up just to make sure these units are screened out and kind of covered. We've got some throwing axe fire into the halberds, and we're now pushing in our Marauder Berserkers to try and lock them down. These infantry are going to catch these units here while the Femir and Wulfric once again begin to hunt the Fey Enchantress. We've got the Hunter of Champions. I haven't popped the sword because I don't think it's off cooldown yet, but she's near her healing cap and won't be able to stay alive much longer. Look at that hit. Wulfric hits like a truck. Yeah, I just popped the sword, and Wulfric really does damage when he does that. Femir are happy. They're in with the Foot Squires. We've dropped the Enfeebling Foe on them, and they should be going down pretty quickly. But these Marauder Hunters with Javelins are just making sure these guys stay away. That's all they need to do. And we're bringing in the Skirmish Cav to help finish off the Fey Enchantress and ensure that the balance of power, sorry, I lost my word for a second there, that the balance of power stays in my favor. And at this point, the game's over. There really isn't enough Bretonnian force on the map to come back. Got some men-at-arms, but men-at-arms are garbage. Got a few Foot Squires, but not enough. The Femir Balefiend alone could probably clean up the remaining Bretonnian infantry, and here we have units shattering all over the field from army losses, and there goes the Fey Enchantress. That little bit of damage she took from the throwing axes tipped her over the edge. So that is the battle. It was a very interesting one, and I think my strategy worked out about like I expected it to. I didn't expect this big, wide peasant build, and if I should have considered that he was probably going to bring a number of peasant bowmen, because peasant bowmen are very cheap and very efficient. And I should have taken the shields on my Marauder Champions with great weapons. I should have dropped this Marauder Berserker and probably taken just a few regular shielded Marauders for chaff purposes, because they can fight men-at-arms just fine. But even so, it worked out all right. The Marauder Hunters with Javelins were very, very good at warding off the questing knights, as of course were the Femir. The Femir really were, I think, the key units in that engagement. They have very high kills because they wiped out, not only did they completely wipe out at least a unit and a half of questing knights, more like 2 units actually, they also broke a whole bunch of infantry after that. Wulfric the Wanderer got a lot of kills with his Sea Fangs and with his melee prowess. He cleaved his way through the enemy infantry, and he did successfully hunt the Fey Enchantress. I should have been more on top of it with him. I should have been moving him more, because I will say this, one thing about Total War Warhammer 2 is you should always be doing something with everybody. You should never have units sitting around standing still. I commonly do, because I get focused on one part of the battlefield and then I realize, oh, I've had a unit standing around for 30 seconds doing nothing, which can be a catastrophic error in Total War games, which move pretty quickly. So, can't let people stand around doing nothing, and there were a couple of times Wulfric was doing that, but even so, he was usually in a fight, and as long as Wulfric is in a fight, he is paying dividends. Yeah, I built this more anticipating a cavalry-focused army, but of course Bretonnia can also do this. They can go very wide with peasants, have a lot of layers, have a lot of range support. Honestly, if you were going to go wide with peasants, though, I probably would have cut out even more cavalry. I probably would have gotten rid of another questing knight, brought a couple more peasant bowmen, just to have a little bit more firepower, because the firepower was the most effective part. That fire was what was breaking my infantry away. And normally Norsca, of course, wins infantry engagements against people like Bretonnia. But with that fire support, I was in fact losing my unshielded Marauder Champions and my armorless Marauder Berserkers pretty quickly. And my Spearmen, of course, were melting. They helped. They provided some support, but mostly the cavalry just avoided them. It was the Femir and the Marauder Horsemen and the Javelins that were a lot harder for the cavalry to deal with. So in any case, a successful first outing. I'll continue experimenting with Norsca. I think I can do better. I don't think this was a perfect build or a perfect strategy, and I can definitely fine-tune it. I want to experiment more with Skin Wolves, because of course they are faster than the Fimir, and I feel I can probably still do quite good work. I definitely want to experiment with Throg, who's a very powerful anti-large combatant, and I just generally want to play around with what Norsca has to offer, play around with the chariots, with some of the bigger monsters. It'll be very interesting, and it'll kind of help keep my hand in while I'm waiting for the Vampire Coast to drop. I'll also be experimenting with a few other factions that I think could be interesting. We will look at, let's pull up our factions here. Other factions I want to look at the Wood Elves, which I have literally never played. I actually never bought the Wood Elf DLC during Total War Warhammer 1. I only bought it after 2, and I've still never played them in multiplayer, not once. I've played against them, but I've never played as them. I want to play as the Beastmen, who I experimented with and who I'm really bad at. And I'd like to play as Bretonnia. I've played as Bretonnia a couple of times, never really got a good grasp on them. I had some success in Total War Warhammer 1, but they've changed a lot since then. I would say I want to play as the Dwarves, but to be frank, I don't want to play as the Dwarves. I've played as the Dwarves a few times, and for some reason I have a huge amount of trouble getting my head around their style. I just fundamentally don't like Dwarven play. So we'll try to look at Wood Elves, at Beastmen, and at Bretonnia in addition to Norsca in the next couple of weeks while we're waiting for the Vampire Coast, and it should be a really good time. So thanks for watching. Hope this was enjoyable or informative or something, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care.